This is a video on how the Roman Republic was governed. We have to remember that the Rome that we think of when we think of Rome, usually we think of Imperial Rome, which is, I guess, from about the 1st century BCE forwards. But for a huge amount of Roman history before that, it wasn't like that at all. And certainly at the beginnings of the Republic, 510 BCE, remember, it was more of a peasant state. Most average Romans worked the land, and they worked the land immediately around Rome, rather than further afield, as later became the case. And if Rome was involved in a conflict, if there was a war with a neighbouring tribe, Romans would put down the plough, and they would pick up weaponry, and they would go and fight for Rome, and when the battle was over, they would return to their farms, which was a reasonably tolerable and functional way to run an army. There wasn't a standing army, there wasn't a group of men paid to fight for Rome at this time. And that meant that the people who were fighting for Rome had a vested interest, especially in a defensive action. If, for example, the Volscians attacked Rome, as they frequently did, the people fighting for Rome, yes, they were defending the idea of Rome, but they were defending their homes, their farms. The Roman army was kind of stratified by class, to the extent that the only men who could fight at the front lines were the men who could afford to buy a sword, a shield, their own equipment. The state didn't provide people with the equipment to fight. There was also another group of people who could afford to buy horses and therefore form a Roman cavalry. This group of people became known as the Equites. I'm just mentioning it in passing, but we are definitely going to talk about that group of people later on. For the time being, just remember that the Equites were the men who were wealthy enough to buy a horse to fight in the Roman army. Anyway, the Roman state was largely run by larger landowners. The reason for this is quite practical and has a number of echoes in ancient Athens. If you are a wealthy landowner, you own slaves and you can employ people to work your land. You yourself do not need to get your hands dirty. And if you know that you have slaves and employees working your land, you can then take the day off in order to go and engage with the politics, the government, the administration of the state. Ordinary people could not afford to take time away from their work as a farmer. So consequently, they did not get involved in governing the state to nearly the same degree. But of course, this led to a whole tier of Roman society, this government of Rome being dominated by what we would call an aristocracy. In passing, aristocracy, we take it to mean the wealthiest people, but strictly speaking, in the Greek, aristocracy means rule by the best, which suggests an inherent snobbery in the word itself. You've got me off the subject, though. So, this aristocratic tier of Roman society became known as the nobiles, from which we get nobility or nobles, which is a very recognisable concept even in the 21st century. But most of these people, as time went on, had ancestors or relatives who had served in Roman government. But equally, it was very difficult for people to break into that tier of government. And if you look at the records for Roman government, specific positions held in Roman government, you see the same names coming back again and again and again and again, as the same wealthy families came to dominate Roman government. There were similarities between Rome and Athens, and it's no coincidence. I mean, the Romans revered Athenian government in some ways. But the similarities could be positive or negative. For example, a huge tranche of the population, as in Athens. Much as we revere Athens and we talk about the cradle of democracy, women couldn't be involved. And the same is true in Rome, nor could slaves or non-Romans or foreigners or people from elsewhere working in Rome. They were all excluded from taking part in the government of the state in which they lived and in which they paid taxes or engaged in business. Only male citizens could sit in assemblies, and this was just as true in Athens as it was in Rome. Only male citizens could pass legislation in the people's assemblies and elect magistrates. Now, we're going to come back to the Senate shortly, but we have to understand from the off that originally the Senate was a small advisory body. It advised the people's assemblies on particular issues. They offered guidance. Notice the SEN of Senate, from which we also have senior or senile. The idea was that these were the oldest and the wisest men in Rome, and they would give the people's assemblies the benefit of their experience in order to guide them to make sensible governmental decisions. But the important thing is originally the Senate advised and the people's assemblies implemented laws. Okay, we're definitely coming back to that, I think, in the next slide. However, in Athens, if we're going to continue with this comparison, loads of citizens ended up taking positions in government, either in councils or in administrative positions. In Athens, they paid their public officials, which meant people from poor backgrounds could have a political career. All citizens had the right to attend the assembly and to be heard at the assembly and to speak and to be involved in its debate. And in that sense, I mean, Athens really was incredibly egalitarian for the small population who was allowed to take part in it. But in Rome, officials were not paid in local government, which of course meant that poor people could not afford to take time away from their farms in order to be involved in government. And that is why Rome developed this aristocratic rule by the nobiles. Not everybody was allowed to to speak at people's assemblies. Annual magistrates, most positions in both Athens and Rome were annual positions. There was obviously some different, but the majority were for 12 months, and you can have that discussion amongst yourselves whether you think our representatives should be elected for just 12 months rather than the 5 years that a current prime minister would receive, for example. Anyway, the annual magistrates were elected by ordinary Romans, quite democratic, and they would meet in their assemblies to exercise their votes during annual elections. But aside from the calendar of official meetings of the people's assemblies, they would only be summoned and meet if a magistrate called them together. And that magistrate would have come from a certain section of Roman society. So the assemblies wouldn't actually have come together to represent ordinary people's needs and requirements as often as would have been ideal, I guess. And importantly, in the people's assemblies, somebody could only speak if the presiding magistrate nominated them directly. So it was perfectly possible for an ordinary Roman citizen to go and sit in the assembly, but even if they had a burning sense of grievance, even if they had an issue that required urgent attention, they couldn't bring it up unless the presiding magistrate addressed them individually, and of course the presiding magistrate would have come from that upper echelon of Roman society. So the Senate, the chamber of old men. As time went on, the Senate became the de facto administering body of the Roman state. It was made up only of men from the great landowning families, those nobiles. Senators were appointed for life. The selection was made every 5 years by the censors, who had a look at the cursus honorum. This was, it's called, literally translated, the run of honours. In ancient Rome, there was a very definite ladder you had to progress through in your political career, and if you couldn't bypass this series of offices. So you had to start at the bottom and work your way up through the cursus honorum. And once you were at a certain point on the cursus honorum, you could be selected as a senator. There were 600 of them, more or less, for most of the republic that we're talking about. And originally, the Senate could only make recommendations to the people's assemblies, and the people's assemblies would consider that advice and then implement it or not. But as time went on, the Senate became the lawmaking chamber of the Roman government. The people's assemblies became less and less involved, less and less necessary, which is why when we think of the Senate of Rome, we consider that chamber. We can all imagine that chamber with the men in togas debating. We've all seen the pictures and it's in the films and so on. And that's what we consider to be Roman government. But that was only much, much later. At the start of the Roman Republic in 510, it was an advisory chamber. By the time we get to the 1st century BCE, indeed by the time we get to the 3rd century BCE, the Senate was effectively running the show. What did that mean for areas outside the city of Rome? Tribes, settlements, cities under Roman control? Well, in terms of administering themselves, the Romans effectively said, do as you like. You know, you can run your government as you see fit, but each of these places would have an obligation to the Roman state. So the Roman state commandeered vast amounts of farmland belonging to these, allies. And then to ensure that these allies would do as Rome wanted them to, they actually sent Roman settlers to occupy farmland in these territories. Essentially, yes, they may have been ordinary people working the land, but they were effectively spies for Rome. So the allies had a sense of grievance because they had farmland taken away from them by the Roman state, they were being spied upon, and they had certain obligations in terms of tax revenue, for example, to the central administration in Rome. The last thing I'm going to mention, because it becomes a massive issue later on, is that these settlers who were sent to Roman territories outside Rome, it led to an increased number of Romans who were not living in Rome. So people who believed they had Roman status, Roman citizenship status, but were not in Rome. And as this period progresses, from 510 forwards, the idea of citizenship and what it means to be a Roman in the Italian peninsula at this time becomes a very vexed question. This is your skinny. You can pause the video to take your notes if you see fit. As usual though, if you want good marks, you'll take more than the bare bones. Any questions, you can see me in class, or alternatively email me or attempt to telepathically communicate with me. I'm open to all of those things.